the beginning of an interview at the Atlanta History Center, Atlanta, Georgia, with Mr. Thomas Shelton. My name is Marilyn Parr, P-A-H-R, and I'll be conducting the interview. Mr. Shelton, can you start by telling us your date and place of birth and what branch of the military you served in and what time period?
Okay, I was born on December 3rd, 1925, here in Atlanta, and I was in the Army. And the dates of service were about sometime in July of 44 until September of 46.
Okay. Can you tell us a little bit about your family background, where you grew up?
I grew up here in Atlanta. My father was a lawyer here. Actually, my mother's family had been here since about 1815, when Atlanta was still Indian territory. My great-grandfather, after whom I was named, whose name, Thomas Connally Shelton, he was Thomas Connally, actually Thomas Watt Connally, had a farm out in the East Point area. And he and his father and certain of their siblings are buried out there near a grammar school. I used to know how to get out there, and Atlanta's changed so much I don't remember that.
So you grew up in that general area, and you were in...
No, I grew up in Buckhead, actually.
Okay. And you were in school then when the war broke out?
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Okay, I had gone to E. Rivers School down the street and into North Fulton High School, but in my senior year, I got a scholarship and went to the Bowl School in Jacksonville, Florida, which was then an all-male prep school. I'd come home for, I think, Thanksgiving, and I got the pneumonia, which they didn't have antibiotics in those days. This is 41. Actually, I woke up with this high fever and turned on the radio and heard about Pearl Harbor on the radio out in the old Piedmont Hospital, which is way out where the stadium is now, the Brave Stadium is now located.
And you would have been how old then?
I would have been just turned 16.
So the war breaks out, you're 16, you're too young to go into the service at that point. But what were your thoughts about your expectation that you would eventually serve?
Yes, I wanted to, you know. But I graduated from this Bowl School. I was 16. I went to the VMI, the Virginia Military Institute, for 2 years until I had turned 18. And then, you know, it was universal draft. I was registered with the draft. You had to wait until they called you. And I was called in July of 44, just a couple of weeks or 3 weeks after the Normandy invasion.
So you were drafted?
Yes.
And the branch of service you were in then was the
Army.
Army.
Right, and I was in the infantry.
How much of the news at that point had you already heard about Normandy at the point when you're just beginning your service?
Well, no one knew where the invasion was going to be. I mean, you know, that was a big secret. So I hadn't heard anything about Normandy until the invasion began. And I was at this infantry replacement. No, I hadn't gone into the service yet at that time. It was a couple of weeks later, sometime in July of 44.
Now, did you have an expectation when you first started your service that you would go to Europe versus the Pacific? Did you know? In 41, that strategy wasn't, I doubt if it was even formulated as the order of things. So when you first went into the service, Where were you when you signed up for the service, and where did you get your training?
Okay, I was had to wait for my draft notice, couldn't advance, and I was called in out at Fort McPherson
Here in Georgia.
here in Atlanta, where I was living, and I was shipped on an old day coach train, no air conditioning. It took us 5 days to get out to Fort Worth, Texas, where we're headed, because the priority of the railroads was freight to go east, getting everything to east to supply the troops in Norman, and we would be sidetracked. Steam engines, a lot of soot, and by the time we got to this camp, it was called Camp Walters, Texas, and it's in Mineral Wells, about 50 miles west of Fort Worth. It's out in the Panhandle, absolutely prairie.
And this is July, it's summer. It's hot.
The temperature would be up to 110. At the replacement training, either 18-year-olds or 38 years old, because the draft kept going up, and the 38-year-olds, married and unmarried, were taken in the same time that my group came in. And we shared these barracks out in the desert near Mineral Wells, Texas.
What was your training like?
Well, it was rigorous, a lot of close order drill. Of course, I'd been by then to 2 military schools, so I knew something about that and other military things. So it wasn't a hard on me, a big adjustment for me the way it was for most of the people who hadn't experienced that before.
So within your unit, you have inexperienced people in terms of military and a wider age group.
Well, it was sort of there's nothing in between 18-year-olds and 38-year-olds. It's the way I remember it, at least. And of course, the 38-year-olds had a much harder time because they were older and less prepared for this hot weather and a lot of marching and outdoor training and things.
Did you feel that with the age difference too? You had said when war broke out, you knew that eventually you wanted to serve. Did you feel that the feeling wasn't the same with the 38-year-olds?
Oh, that's a good question, and I'm not sure of how I would answer that. They would, and within a barracks, the age groups would hang together.
So once your training was completed there in Texas, where did you go next?
Well, because of my experience in military schools, and incidentally, North Fulton High School here had ROTC, and I started marching and close order drill and all that kind of thing, even here. North Fulton is now called the International School. So I'm drifting off. Where's the question?
So you had some military background experience.
Right, at least with, in a superficial sense, in marching and counter-marching, all the detail connected with that.
And so when your training was over in Texas?
I was expecting to be shipped out with my fellows, and we had friends and all, to Europe. But because of this military experience, I was held at Fort Walters, Texas. It was then called Camp Walters, by the way. It was not a permanent camp. It was just a hurriedly put together barracks and training field out in the desert. I was surprised when I was held back, and they said, "No, we want you to stay here and help train the troops." I was disappointed by that. I tried to change it around, and in the Army you can't have your way.
So were you ever able, you never shipped out overseas then?
No, I was stateside the whole time.
Okay. But you did your part then in training a great many number of men.
Right. There were 17-week cycles, and you ship those out. Maybe it's a week off to get the barracks cleaned up good, and then you welcome in a new group and start training them again.
Now, is throughout this period, every new group that came in, was it still the 18-year-olds and then the 38-year-olds?
Right, as I recall, right. And they were actually some that had been, if I remember, had been 4F for whatever the reason, were brought in because of there was a need of replacements for the troops that we were losing by death or by wounds in Europe and in the Far East. At that time, MacArthur was island hopping, a lot of Marines primarily in that, as I recall. But
did you know with each group that you trained where they eventually went?
I knew that they went to Europe. I'm not aware of any going to the Pacific area. At the time of the Battle of the Bulge, I was still there, and I'd gone, my older brother had been in Italy as an officer in an all-black infantry division, and armed forces were still segregated in those days. And he had gone up on the Italian campaign and gone all the way up to almost to France, but had been brought back to Fort Leavenworth in Kansas for some additional training in anticipation of a promotion. I had had occasion to go up there to Arkansas, where my brother was stationed, by bus. I got a weekend pass, went up there by bus, and coming back, I'm sitting in the bus station and seeing one of the guys that I had trained with and he hadn't been gone more than 6 or 8 weeks. He'd been already to Europe. He was wounded, had big casts on and crutches, and infantry combat bags, and he was already home. And that brief a time, that impressed me hugely.
Did your brother try to pass along any advice to you in what he thought you needed to do with the men you were training?
Well, he was about 8 years older than me, and we have other brothers, but he and I were particularly close. He had gone to VMI, so he gave me lots of advice along the way and all of these things.
Is there any one thing that sticks out in your mind that he said to you?
This is sort of ridiculous. When we were going to VMI, he said the way to get attention and impress people is to shine your shoes well. So he taught me this complicated way of burning shoes and everything to get a shine. That didn't particularly help me. In fact, not at all, I would say.
Did you try to pass that along to your men?
No.
It didn't impress you, so you
No, I tried.
During this time period, from what I've read, there was an expectation that possibly the war would have been over by Christmas of '44. Was that the sense that you had?
No. When was the atom bomb exploded?
Not until '45.
That's what I was thinking. So there was an expectation the European war would be over, but then the focus was on Japan. I was expecting to go to Japan. And, this before the atom bomb, we thought it would take And the way the Japanese were defending those islands and this whole kamikaze attitude and all, it was expected there to be 1 million Americans killed or wounded in the invasion of Japan. And since I thought I was going to be one of them, I was really indebted to Harry Truman for using the bomb to stop the war.
I'm going to get back to that in a couple of minutes. I want to go back a little bit in time. D-Day has happened. You're training troops. You're sending them overseas. Patton's army is moving. We seem to have made a lot of progress, and then the Battle of the Bulge.
Right.
And from what I've read, a lot of replacements came in then, a lot of more men.
Right. And this one that I described, that I saw, was probably in the Battle of the Bulge. It may have been a little longer period of time than I indicated initially.
Did that ever change the time period of the training? You mentioned 17 weeks. Did that ever get shortened?
No, not where I was.
Okay, and could you maybe tell us a little bit then, your role on any given day in the training? There was the marching drills, and was it always infantry? You were always training in the infantry division?
Yes. Well, like any schooling, which is where you had different stages of the training. Initially, there's a lot of close order drill, a lot of shouting at them like people think of in Marine boot camp, and I've always said we were just as tough as they were to get them straightened out and used to being away from family, from whether it's parents or wives. Say that for a month, and you know we now have marathon runners all the time. The big event would be in that 17 weeks was a 5-mile hike. Can you imagine that? Everybody goes out for 5. All right, you did have to have full backpack with and with ammunition and everything on. The ammunition was blanks.
What else would be in the backpack?
Well, you have a half of a tent. Little pup tents. Well, you'd have half of one, and the wooden stakes for the tent. You'd have a poncho for the weather. You'd have a steel helmet that you had helmet liners is what you really wore during the training period out, but if you'd go on these long hikes, you had to carry this heavy steel helmet that you used to wash your hands and face and all when you're out in the bush.
And did you always accompany your men on the hike?
Right.
Did it
I hate to call them my men because I'm at that point still an 18-year-old, and I'm acting. An acting corporal, but I'm still being paid as a private, $21 a month or something like that. And I was just part of the scheme of things. Not a very big deal.
What was the food like?
I've always, I've never had trouble with liking food, and the food was I recall, it was okay, it was good, But in the 110, 115 degree heat, you drank lots of water, and you were encouraged to take salt pills, which nowadays is totally contrary to what you would have. Salt is an enemy rather than a friend, but in this heat, you're perspiring all the time, and they encourage you to take salt pills. I don't know what that did. I remember that in the barracks next to mine, I think it was when I was still a trainee, one of these 38-year-olds, one of them died from heat exhaustion, standing out in the sun, no trees in that part of Texas.
During this time period, too, you mentioned that you had other brothers. Did you communicate often with your family? Was it letters? Did you get chances to go home?
Letters were a big deal. I think I was in almost a year before I got to come home. I was still wanting to get into officers candidate school despite my eyes, and in those days they were concerned about you losing your glasses and no contacts. And actually, a little episode is at the end of this training period, you're out on bivouac and you try to simulate the actual combat as much as you can. One of my jobs was to take plastic explosives and set them off near the men. They're crawling on their belly through this simulated attack. There's a machine gun fire up above, and they're crawling on the... My job was to go along and set off this explosive real close to them, which would be very startling at the least. Of course, for an 18-year-old, that was sort of fun to be getting those. Another example was they had a barnyard with a lot of booby traps, and a booby trap is essentially a hand grenade that you attach a wire to. You bury the hand grenade in a spot, and you have a tripwire that goes out to it, and if somebody comes along, trips over the tripwire, the hand grenade goes off, and seriously it wounds them, if not killing them. Well, my job was to lay booby traps that were really just firecrackers and hide them and get the little wires across, and I had fun with that. But I believe that all that is effective in preparing troops who are basically totally uninformed in anything about it, giving them a prior experience so that it's not so devastating when they get over in combat. But whatever you do, it's always, I understand, a totally different experience and a lot more shocking and difficult.
So you're trying to make it as realistic as you can.
Right, right.
During this time period, now we're going to go back to where we sort of left off in the time period, the Battle of the Bulge. More and more replacements are going, but then there is a turning point where that's over, and we seem to be on the positive side again.
Well, you mean the war in Europe ends?
And even as it's just before it's ending, as we're going into early spring, like, do you remember where you were or what the news when they announced that FDR had died?
I do. I was out in the field. We were camping out in the field in Texas, way away from the camp, and the news spread just like that. I'm probably 5 or 10 miles out from the camp, but I heard about it almost immediately, I think.
And what was the general feeling, people you were with?
Well, a point of disappointment and concern. And he had been the great leader since the 30s, and it really led us through the war. And there was upset, a clear sense of loss.
And shortly thereafter that, then you get news that the European theater of operations, the war is over. How did you hear that? What was your first? Well,
I get that mixed up with, because they were not too distant from each other. Roosevelt's death and hearing that the war had ended. I remember there was a huge celebration in the camp that night, in the barracks area. First off, they let everybody have a 3-day pass and go into town. What you'd do is you'd go to Fort Worth or Dallas, unless you had family or somebody. I mix up the, I can remember the camp. There was, they also let you have a lot more beer, a much larger beer ration that you would have otherwise, and There was a lot of drinking and celebration and happiness because the war had ended.
Do you remember what you personally did?
Well, I drank a lot of beer, and I went as the top sergeant in my battalion. The battalion sergeant major was a tough guy, and I remember going in and waking him up. I'm under the influence of beer. Maybe he was, maybe he was not, but he took it very well. He wasn't.
You woke him up to tell him the war was over?
No, just to tell him what an SOB he was.
Now, were you thinking then you could tell him that in your military was over because the war was over?
Well, no, I just felt this was it was a timeout. It was a period of sort of timeout. So the bomb wasn't blown until that summer, as I recall. So the emphasis turned from Europe to the Pacific, and you had training for island invasion as well as the beginnings of training for invasion of Japan.
How did that change in terms of what the drills you did with the men, from going from training for Europe to training for island fighting?
Well, the basics are still the same, but you may have, for example, one time, I guess it would be training for the European area. I was still a trainee, I think, and I was staked out on the side of this sort of hill, and my camouflage was ragweed. Well, I happen to be hugely allergic to ragweed, and I told them that. I said, I'm not going to be quiet because I'm going to be sneezing. And they wouldn't accept that. They left me in the ragweed. So it's a perimeter defense, as if, the Americans held this hill, and the Japanese, who are really good at infiltrating, crawling in on their belly, would be coming up the hill. Well, I'm sneezing, so nobody came near me that night. The next day, because I had such a huge allergic reaction that I broke out, my eyes swelled up and everything. I went to the sick call, and the doctor, so I'll show you the kind of some of the doctors were. He wouldn't accept that. He said, "There's not a ragweed in 150 miles of here." And I said, "Well, Lieutenant, what do you think caused this? I happen to know I'm allergic to ragweed, but maybe you have another theory." So much for that.
So you still had to continue to do the same thing after you recovered from that?
Except that you had more emphasis on, instead of being on the hillside which would be the way in Europe, you anticipate heavy, for the islands at least, heavy jungle, and you didn't have much of that kind of thing in Texas, but there were areas where there's trees and more mesquite bushes, and you try to simulate some of that, but it wasn't very realistic.
Could you remember during those men who happened to be in training somewhere in that 17-week when the European war is over, that particular unit who might have thought they might have been going to Europe, do they still go? Do they immediately go to the Pacific? Do you remember that particular unit, that time frame? Because now there's this sudden shift.
Well, remember we continued to occupy Germany and other areas. So there were men needed for that, and the men that had been in heavy combat, particularly for more than 2 years, were being released. Some had been in for 4, 5 years. So there was a lot of men being released, but we still needed to maintain troop levels there. So some would go to Europe, and some would go to the Pacific.
Did you get a sense at all that there was, I know that you don't get a preference because the Army tells you where to go, but did you get a sense that the men had a preference for one or the other?
Well, I think the preference would be Europe, you know. It's more our kind of a place, less strangeness about it. And
So then when the bomb is dropped, how did you hear about it? Could you tell us a little bit about, and then there's just a couple days later for the second one, so can you tell us where you were?
Well, again, I'm with these troops out, and I remember always, I don't know why, being out in the field, camp, bivouacking out on the prairie somewhere, rather than being in camp, except for the Victory in Europe Day. I do remember being in camp, and you remember I told you I was getting a top sergeant and all like that. But I think, again, I was out just as when Roosevelt died. I think I was out in the field somewhere when I heard about the atom bomb. And I think there was immediately a sense that this was going to be it. I guess one of my jobs, since I perhaps had more education than the other enlisted, corporals, sergeants, etc., I probably had a little more education. I had the job of trying to keep the platoon that you're responsible for up to date with the news and political things. There'd be a period of maybe sometimes as much as 45 minutes where I would talk to them about current news and current events. I don't remember there being much response or much interest really in that.
How did you get your news for you to be able to tell them? How are you getting informed?
Well, it's interesting. I had had been given by my father a subscription to Time magazine, and Time was Luce was still operating, and he's very much a Republican, and so I was sort of opting that, 18 and 19 years old, you take what you read. So they probably heard a lot of that. But there would also be, the Army would put out news bulletins. It'd be on the bulletin board, but there was still time set aside at least once a week where they were trying to orally update, give them some sense of what's going on.
When the first bomb dropped, did you think the war would just be over? Did you think there would be a second one? Were you surprised that there was a second one?
I did not anticipate a second one. None of us knew much about it. This was a whole new technology. No one really knew. Truman has been criticized for dropping the second one with the huge numbers of people that were killed for that. There had been one explosion, in New Mexico. Not the full. So we weren't sure what that was all. That was. You're glad to see you probably had the idea that you knew the war would probably end fairly quickly then.
And then it did.
And then it did.
You got
right.
The announcement. So you continue your training. You were in the service for another year.
Right.
So what did you do?
I was, despite my, I'd earlier been, I didn't mention this, I had been wanting to go to officers' candidate school, particularly to the infantry school down here in Columbus, which is still a headquarters of infantry and all. And I passed all the tests and got selected. This is probably, well, it was after my brother came home, but it was probably in the, I'm not connecting well. You kept me back on track. Where was I?
Do you think it's sometime perhaps in the fall then? Did you leave Texas and go somewhere
Well,
else?
first I probably in the early spring, I was sent down to, they had eye requirements. And I wouldn't have even gotten in the Army, much less the infantry, if I hadn't gone to a doctor here in Atlanta that specialized in giving eye exercises. And I had to train through all these different machines and exercising the eyes, and it does help, but it's temporary. It's not a permanent thing. So I had gotten, even to get into the Army by going to this guy 2 or 3 times a week, I had improved my eyesight to like 20/40. And could get along without glasses. Then I'm out there for a year without any exercises. I'm sent down to, I'm accepted from the infantry school in Columbus. But I get down there and they give me an eye test. Well, I had, of course, memorized the charts, but the doctor was smart enough to switch the charts around, and I was turned down and sent back to Texas. After the war ended, they were looking up in the records, and they sent me the Transportation Corps Officers Candidate School down near New Orleans on the other side of Lake Pontchartrain. This is after the war. And while we were there, they said, if you want to complete Officer Candidate School, you're going to have to sign up for 2 years. Well, that was a hard decision, but, you know, I'm still young and patriotic or something. I signed up to finish it, and so I could finish the OCS, and I was then sent to out to, I can't remember the name of this camp, but I left a blank on that paper. It's in the city limits of Seattle, and it was a camp. It later became called a fort, which, you know, like Fort McPherson was a training camp during World War II, but anyway, it achieved its status. And I had different jobs relating to transportation, and then I was never been quite clear of the reason, but I was transferred from this fort in Seattle to an office job in Chicago, where my primary job was meeting war bride trains. By then, see, it's well into 46. The war brides in Europe were coming from the east, and those from Australia, New Zealand, and mostly those kind of places where there wasn't much interracial. They would be coming from the Pacific coast, no air transport, you know. Then these huge trains, all with women, going to wherever their husbands are or would be. And Chicago then had 5 different train stations, depending on which direction you're coming from, east, west, south, etc. And my job was to get them off the trains, into a bus, get to the next station, put them on the trains, and see them away.
And
I've been teased about that, but that was...
You didn't pick up a war bride for yourself?
No, I didn't.
And most of these women probably didn't speak English?
Well, the only ones I'm really remembering are those who did speak English. There were lots of English war brides and Irish, Scotch, New Zealand, Australia, that sort of thing.
That was a very interesting change for you.
It really was.
Do you remember when you first were told that would be your job?
Well, it was. See, I was in this office, and they had a civilian who was the administrative head of this office. And I guess he was anxious about his job because of me and my education. He would not give me anything to do. So I signed up at evening school at Northwestern and sat around, and this is typical Army, sat around during the day doing my homework. Then he had a nervous breakdown, and suddenly I have his job, which I'm the youngest officer of a group of 10 or 15 in this office. Anyway, they picked me to be the administrative officer, so I stopped the war brides. And then I wasn't, when in Chicago, they gave you, there were no barracks, no quarters, particularly for officers. And I've looked in the want ads or something, or maybe the Army helped me find a place to live with a family out near Evanston, where Northwestern is. 3 daughters and a son, all grown, basically my age. The father was a doctor that didn't come back from Europe, didn't come back. While I'm there, the mother tells me, this Irish mother, that she learned that he wasn't coming back. He was taken up with a woman, and so things weren't much better in those days and now. Anyway, I went to Northwestern at night and took these courses. When the man that I was talking about that was claiming power for himself and all had a nervous breakdown, these older officers, and I decided I was the one to help run the office, so I quit seeing war brides at that point.
Did you use the GI Bill to go
I
to school?
used the GI Bill. It was a great help for me. It really wasn't enough to make do. The guys that were married, I don't know how they did it if they had no other sources of income, but my father sent me a small check to help me with the living expenses, as did the Army. But they paid the tuition, and I got a terrific education that I wouldn't have gotten but for the GI Bill. I went to I had intended to go back to VMI, but by the time I got out of the Army in October of 46, VMI had started, and I said, well, can I get in? I went by there. I was so sure I was going to get to VMI. I got a ride with some friends of these people I was living with from Chicago to New York, and got the train, went to Lynchburg, took the bus over to VMI, and they said, no, it's too late. We have absolutely no room. And I said, well, how about January? And they said, we're not going to start a class in January. The earliest you can come is a year from now. And I said, well, will you transfer all the engineering courses that they gave at VMI? They drafted a lot of people, and it really shrunk, so they abolished liberal arts, which is what I needed for pre-war. I'm giving you a lot of unnecessary detail. I'm sorry. But anyway, they said, you'll have to wait a year, and we're not going to give you credit for those engineering courses. So I went to Carolina at Chapel Hill and got a terrific preparation for law school. I went to Yale to law school, and all thanks to the GI Bill. But you'd get a check from the government. They'd pay your tuition, buy your books, as I recall, and then my father helped out some as well.
So from the time you left service, you continually went to school. You got a degree at Carolina,
right,
and then you went right on to Yale.
Right, and finished in 51 and came back here to Atlanta to practice law.
Wonderful. Can you tell us a little bit then about your personal life after the war? Did you marry?
Right.
Did you meet your
I
wife?
finished law school in '51. I wasn't sure whether I wanted to come back to Atlanta or not. I found that I enjoyed the different perspectives. The South was totally segregated. It was culturally different from what I had experienced in Seattle and in Chicago. And I liked the idea of getting out of the South and getting educated. Of course, Yale is it's much smaller than the Harvard Law School, which is about 4 times big. So at Yale, we've got a lot more intimate. It's like living in a small town. You know a lot more people than if you live in a big town. So this is a small law school, about 180 in a class, and get to know each other well. I had thought, well, I'm going back if I can get a job, and there were 2 or 3 firms in Atlanta I identified, maybe 4, which is still, in my view, the best 4 firms in Atlanta. Of course, they were very small then. My firm, which was then called Smith, Kilpatrick, Cody, Rogers, and McClatchy. They believed in syllables as well as name, was the largest in Atlanta. They had 9 lawyers. I became the 10th lawyer. And I got the job. If I hadn't gotten with one of those 3 firms, what's now King and Spalding and Alston and Bird and Kilpatrick and Sutherland Asbell, I would have gone for a job in New York, where most of our classmates were going. But happily, I got the job, and I stayed with the same firm. I'm retired now, but they give me an office and a secretary, and actually I'm the oldest in age and in tenure of some 500 lawyers. And I have an office, and they give me a secretary, and it's a great perk. It's somewhere for me to go in the day. My wife, when she was still living, loved it. You know, her attitude and her friends was, you know, for better or for worse, but not for lunch. So most men, when they retired, that was it. But I'm still going down to that place.
Can you talk at all about how you think that maybe the military influenced your life after the war, having that experience?
Well, there's a certain rebelliousness in me, despite all that military. I still cannot be on time. I'm one of these people that typically late. Friends and I've come to expect that. So it didn't help me in that regard. But there's no doubt that the hardening of the experience in the service and the opportunities for being an authority, etc., did me a lot of good. Actually, when I was a private acting as a corporal, running this platoon most of the time, I had a lot more responsibility than I had at any time after I became an officer. As an officer, I was essentially sort of an administrative person. There was no real responsibility for the care and attention of the troops. But when I was at that acting corporal with this platoon, they were my men. You know, I cared about them, and you had to, since I was the youngest enlisted, what do they call them, NCOs, I had the job of breaking the blisters after these long hikes, and their feet weren't in shape. I had to break the blisters with a needle and treat the feet and do other things that really don't even bear mentioning, but was part of the job. All that did me good. I had this experience I never would have had. I really firmly believe in universal service for men and women. I think it's an equalizer. You suddenly find yourself on the same level, and you realize you're no better or worse than the next guy. But then you see how you realize how much education means. Those that didn't have it are handicapped, and those that didn't take it seriously are handicapped. So while before my time in the service, I did okay in school. I didn't have the same motivation. I didn't realize you have to personally experience and live with people on a day-by-day basis to realize how important education is. So after the war, I took it seriously and hit the books hard. Made Phi Beta Kappa and got some other recognition at Carolina, and then got into Yale Law School, which it's really hard to get into. It was, even in those days, 10 times worse now. And my class in law school, less than 200, because they had no continuity with college, except the real young ones in our class. But most of us were well into our 20s before we entered the law school and had the experience of the service, and really developed a lot of individual rapport. And I still have a number of, I don't have the close friends from BMI, because that class was all broken up. Those that went back at different times and finished in different classes. They have a 2-class designation. And the University of North Carolina, even then, was so much bigger, relatively. The only members of your class you were close to were those if you, in your dormitory, if you stayed in the same, or in particular living in fraternity house, which I did and totally enjoyed. This man that was here was a fraternity brother back then. Now I graduated in 48. That's a long time we've been together. To start out, there were 7 of us, fraternity brothers at Chapel Hill, that moved back to Atlanta. All the others except CB, who was here, grew up in Atlanta, but he grew up in Charlotte. But we're like brothers, you know. The way I suppose would have been if we had been in active combat together. But that group, most of them were younger than I. I knew them, got to know them much better after we all moved back to Atlanta than I did in the 2 years at Carolina, because I was studying all the time. They still kid me about that, being a bookworm.
And do you still maintain close relationships with Yale classmates?
Yes. We've had our 50th reunion a couple of years ago, and we well, actually, my VMI class, even though it was up there, on both occasions for the 50th reunion, we raised more money than anybody else had, you know. Contributions from, you know, from the individual classmates. They, as you know, they're all colleges and universities really big build up the 50th reunion. That's the last chance to get significant contributions. So.
Did you ever attend any military reunions?
No. See, unfortunately, I wasn't in a real unit. It was a training program that had no cohesiveness. I regret I maintained some contact in the early years with people I was in the barracks with, and that they were three of us that were particularly close during our own training period, the 17 weeks. Two of them went to Europe, and we kept contact, and there was a third one at some other base I was at. We kept contact for a while, but then the years go by, and unfortunately there's no occasion for a reunion. There is no reunion, so you lose.
So did you ever have an opportunity to hear from any of the fellows that you had trained?
No.
Is there anything else that you would like to put on the tape that we haven't covered?
Only to say that I would not take anything for my experience. I think I've said that earlier in the Army. It helped me in my maturity and my whole perspective of life. I have 3 sons. I wish that they had to go in the service. I think it would have been really good for them. And I believe in the idea of universal service, whether it's in the military or otherwise, for men and women, for the reasons I've indicated. I don't doubt if we'll ever go to that, but I would hope so.
Well, thank you very much, not only for the interview today, but for your contribution to the war effort. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm remembering one other thing, and that is after I got through the 17 weeks, well, actually even before, one of my buddies who was from somewhere in southeast Texas, it was one of my close friends, knew a family in Fort Worth, which was 50 miles away, and we'd get a weekend mass. You'd have to hitchhike, and there was no problem in those days about hitchhiking. There's no danger in it. People would pick up servicemen and bring them in. We went in, and I would go in with him, and his girlfriend got me a date with her friend. And there were really the two families took us in. You know, we would go in and spend the night at the YMCA in Fort Worth or someplace like that. When families would have us over to dinner and take us to church, and I think we were much luckier than a lot of the troops were in that we had that relationship. One of the girls, the one that I dated, I lost track of, but the other one, my friend's girlfriend, went to Sweetbriar College, which is in Lynchburg, or out of Lynchburg, Virginia, near VMI. And I saw her after the war. She was real pretty. But then she got engaged and got married, and that ended that. But the interest of Americans in the troops, you know, that some would go down to the, what is the name of the service organization for the military? You know, I'm blocking the name. We still have it.
Yeah.
I'm not getting it. But families would go down and pick up some guys and take them to lunch, and Thanksgiving, Christmas, all like that. There was because there was such a spirit about the war effort, there was spirit among families about looking after troops that were away from home.
You did not tell us where you did meet your wife.
Well, I met her after I had gotten out of law school, and she graduated from Sweetbriar College in 53 and came to Atlanta, and I had been practicing law here for a couple of years. It was a funny thing, though, when I was born out in Druid Hills on Oakdale Road. I was the fourth of son, but I was the only one that was a surprise. It was unintended. And the family, this was in the 20s, during the boom times, the family considered the house was no longer big enough. So they built a house here in Atlanta on Habersham Road. It'd been in the 20s. My father was doing well as a lawyer, and my grandfathers had died, and my mother had come in some money, so it was quite a big house. My father, when the Depression came and hit, he lost his health. He became seriously asthmatic. We had to move out. Well, first we tried Miami. I went down there with just my mother and father and a cook, and went to school down there for a couple of months. And the next year we tried New Mexico and Roswell, which then had about 11,000 people, and I had to walk to school. I was the only boy in short pants. Everybody else had jeans. And my mother fought it, but my father finally got her to get me a pair of jeans. That did me a lot of good, of that transfer, having to go into a strange school in the middle of the year and being from another part of the country. That did me a lot of good, too. I guess that should be all.
I guess I just wanted to clarify what you were referring to before. Was it the USO? Was that what you were
USO,
thinking of?
that's right. That's right.
So we just get that on right.
Right.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed it.